Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are moving far, far away from the halls of power in Berlin, steering clear of that familiar narrative of the Weimar Republic.
Right.
Instead, we're going to zoom in on a single and I think astonishingly resilient community. It's a village nestled right on the banks of the Mosel River, Pontaricum, during those tumultuous years between 1919 and 1932.
And it's such an essential microhistory to look at. I mean, when people study the Weimar era, they always focus on the big stuff, right?
Yeah, the assassinations, the politics.
Exactly. The political assassinations, the reparations, the dizzying culture of the big cities. But the sources you've pulled together, they let us ground ourselves in the reality of small-town life.
In what it actually looked like.
Yes. How survival actually looked on the ground when the central government became, let's be honest, utterly irrelevant, even destructive.
So let's define the mission for you right now. We're trying to answer what I think is a pretty profound question. How did a community not just survive, but actively reorganize and even reaffirm its identity when the national state retreated, the currency completely failed, and external occupation was just the daily norm?
And the story of Pontaricum really is the answer.
It is, and it's rooted in this extreme local resilience, a kind of necessary self-organization, and this is my favorite part, a really healthy dose of defiant humor.
The defiant humor is so key.
Yeah.
The atmosphere of this whole period was just defined by this existential angst.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, just imagine the weight of it. You've got the French military occupation literally pressing down on your spirit, and at the same time you have this staggering hyperinflation that is weighing on your stomach.
Right.
And yet this intense pressure, it fostered this profound Trotzstim mentality. It's a German word that sort of means a spirit that says, despite all this, we persist.
In spite of everything.
We defy and we rebuild.
Exactly.
The complete failure of the national structure, it forced the village to reinvent its entire civic and economic life from scratch.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey. It's really defined by these stark contrasts. We're going to move from the chaotic, just bewildering absurdity of paper money losing all its value.
The Millionaires of Misery.
The Millionaires of Misery, I love that. And then we're going to move through this highly dramatic physical crisis, a fire, that actually becomes a catalyst for real institutional change. And finally, we'll look at how cultural strength and civic pride, well, they served as the bedrock of their character.
It's really the ultimate testament to the power of decentralized community action.
Let's start right there, where the crisis hit hardest and first, the economy, right after the armistice of World War I. The sources, they paint a picture of just total systemic failure.
It really was. And the collapse wasn't just financial, it was existential. It forced these small Mosel communities to just discard all the assumptions of modern finance and revert back to the most basic structures of survival.
So what did that actually look like?
Well, the post-war economic collapse was so devastating because it wasn't a sudden shock. It was this drawn-out, agonizing loss of faith in money itself.
So it wasn't like a market crash one day. It was a slow decay.
A slow, grinding decay. Money stopped doing its three critical jobs. It wasn't a reliable store of value. It wasn't a useful medium of exchange. And it certainly wasn't a unit of account.
It's just paper.
It's just paper. And when the currency system dies like that, the social contract that holds the whole centralized economy together, it just dissolves with it. For Pontaricum, this meant they had no choice but to turn inward.
And the numbers we have from the sources, they are so illustrative of this breakdown. They make the absurdity completely palpable. Get this. A full day's wage, working tirelessly in the vineyard, was a meager 3.20 mark.
Right, which sounds like nothing, but you have to ask what it could actually buy.
What could it buy?
Almost nothing. It was effectively worthless. That 3.20 mark, the pay for an entire day of back-breaking manual labor, was barely enough to afford 1 pound of butter.
1 pound of butter.
Or, and this is probably more telling for the region, a single glass of beer.
That's just dehumanizing. The physical effort you're putting in bears zero relation to the reward.
None whatsoever. The effort was real. The reward was a complete phantom. The psychological toll of that is just immense.
And the visual evidence of this collapse is maybe the most surreal detail we found. We read about people who literally had to carry their money, their life savings, in huge containers.
Laundry baskets?
Yeah. The source says they were literally taking laundry baskets full of worthless paper money to the baker. It stops being finance and it just becomes a logistical nightmare.
Think about the physical absurdity of that.
Yeah.
You're transporting cash that weighs more than the loaf of bread you're trying to buy. It fundamentally altered all behavior, and it led directly to this necessity of self-reliance and the revival of the barter economy.
Okay, I want to dig into that a little deeper. Barter. It sounds almost romantic, trading goods for goods, but if money is truly worthless, how do you standardize that exchange?
That's a great question.
Like, who decides how many bottles of wine equals a box of nails? Did they have some kind of local exchange rate?
Well, that's the essential insight that you miss from a high-level summary.
All right.
The sources confirm this massive revival of local barter. And while, no, we don't have a ledger from the, Pontaricum Exchange Rate Board,
Right.
the standardization was really driven by the existing local economic leaders. The innkeepers, the big wine merchants, the tradesmen who needed raw materials.
So the people who already had the most valuable local commodity wine or had access to external supplies like nails or leather, they suddenly gained immense power in this new localized economy.
Exactly. The region's real wealth, its wine, became the dominant liquid currency. The records specifically note that wine was actively traded for essential industrial goods like nails. A carpenter needs nails. A vintner needs tools. Wine settles the account.
And for personal stuff.
For personal necessities, we see things like spec-cured bacon being traded for shoes. The local network completely bypassed the broken national finance system.
But it must have also cemented the existing hierarchy, right, of land and resource ownership. If you had wine and bacon, you were king.
Absolutely. Those who control the tangible, tradable goods control this new microeconomy. So what looks like charming self-reliance was also, a very real redistribution of power, shifting control away from Berlin's financial institutions and right into the hands of Pontaricum's traditional local elites.
And we have to remember, this intense economic freefall was happening at the same time as this really volatile political reality.
Right. You can't separate them. The sources remind us that after the initial American occupation forces withdrew after World War I, the French military occupation took definitive hold. And that created a really severe layer of external control that just made the internal poverty even worse.
So the French presence must have felt so oppressive. It limits your ability to maneuver, to seek help from outside. How did that external pressure mix with the internal collapse?
The occupation was a constant physical reminder of their powerlessness. The French military enforced strict controls. They restricted movement, assembly, demanded compliance. They would often impose burdens like requisitioning goods or housing for soldiers.
So on top of being broke, you have foreign soldiers in your town hall.
Exactly. And this external force, combined with the extreme internal poverty, it just amplified the local need for absolute self-organization. If you can't rely on the German state, and the French occupying state is an obstacle, well, the only reliable unit left is your neighbor.
And that lack of a safety net, the absolute desperation,
Yep.
it had profound consequences. The sources connect this local economic failure directly to a broader, really tragic regional trend: mass immigration.
Yes.
This wasn't abstract economic theory. This was people making the ultimate painful choice to just leave.
It reveals a terrifying social reality. We see records, and they specifically mention figures like a man named Schreiner Klein from Gmunden. He was a carpenter. In his emigration application to the Prussian authorities, he made his reasons crystal clear. He stated he could no longer feed his wife and 8 children.
8 children.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't sustain a family that large on a wage that buys a single glass of beer. It's impossible.
It's impossible. And the language he used in his application is chilling. He explicitly mentioned the money shortage was so extreme that people might be, and this is a quote, in extreme need and temptation to take means that are forbidden.
Wow. Means that are forbidden.
It's not just a threat of hunger. It was a societal acknowledgement that this level of poverty was driving people to crime, to extreme measures, just to survive.
That phrase really hammers home the breakdown of basic civic order that desperation breeds. It tells you everything about the state of morality when feeding your family might require you to break the law.
And the solution they saw was radical. They saw no alternative but to leave for distant lands like Brazil or America. The sources highlight records of immigration from Pontaricum's past as well.
So this wasn't the first time.
No, not at all. Matthias Joseph Rees went to Brazil in 1810, others to North America in the 1850s. But while those earlier periods were defined by physical scarcity, crop failures, poor wine years, the post-WWI era brought this new kind of financial instability that led to the same devastating conclusion: to leave or starve.
The government offered no safety net. Emigration was the only way out.
It was seen as the only viable solution, despite all the dangers of the journey and the heartache of leaving everything and everyone you've ever known behind.
It's such a powerful narrative contrast, isn't it? On one hand, you have this incredible communal resilience we're about to explore, rooted in deep local history.
Right.
And on the other, you have this fundamental recurring crisis that forces generations to repeat the desperate act of their ancestors, just because the current moment is as unlivable as the famine years of the 1800s. The currency collapse translated directly into human migration and despair. So, if the hyperinflation was this slow, systemic failure of the central government, the next event we have is a sudden, dramatic, physical failure that became the ultimate catalyst for change.
The point of no return.
Exactly. The community just couldn't afford to wait for Berlin anymore. They were literally brought to their knees by the fire of 1924.
This incident is the perfect case study. It's a community realizing that its infrastructure, which had been, adequate for a previous century, was now utterly obsolete. It was unfit for the stresses of this new reality.
What happened?
On July 17, 1924, a major fire breaks out in the Kirchstraße. It rapidly consumes the homes of the Gibbert, Endries, and Schmitz families.
And the tragedy wasn't just the fire itself, was it? It was the spectacular, very public display of institutional incompetence that followed. What kind of fire protection did Pontaricum even have at that moment?
They were still legally dependent on the Pflichtfeuerwehr, the compulsory fire service.
Compulsory, so not volunteers.
Not volunteers. And to understand why this failed so badly, you need to understand the framework. It was mandatory. The concept was basically codified as everyone must, but no one really wants to.
That's not a great mission statement for an emergency service.
Not at all. You had legally mandated participation,
Yeah.
so anyone of a certain age and physical ability could be called upon. But, and this is the critical part, there was no mandate for professional training, for organization, or for any kind of personal investment.
So it guaranteed you'd have a crew that was physically there, but maybe psychologically absent, and with zero operational efficiency.
Exactly. It created a situation where obligation completely trumped competence. And the source material records, this tone of profound local shame, that this forced corps was completely overwhelmed by the 1924 fire and, quote, had to watch helplessly as these historic houses just burned to the ground.
Watched helplessly.
They lacked the training, the discipline, and probably the equipment to manage a fire of that scale.
That is the definitive image of the old system's collapse. But then came the critical, humbling moment. The cavalry arrived, but it was the neighbors, not the state.
Yes, and this was the definitive turning point, the moment of deep collective shame. The neighboring fire corps from the town of Bredel arrived.
And they were different.
Night and day. The Bredel Fire Department was organized, disciplined, professional. They showed up and extinguished a blaze with undeniable efficiency and skill. And this very public display of competence from their peers, it brutally exposed Pontaricum's local deficiency.
And that must have stung.
Oh, the sources are very clear on this. It says this professional contrast hurt the pride of the Pontaricers deeply.
And that collective wound to their local pride, that became the most effective fuel for immediate action. Pride accomplished what government regulation never could. The community response was so impressively rapid, too. This wasn't some slow bureaucratic reaction. It was an act of immediate communal self-empowerment.
It was almost surgical in its speed and its decisiveness. Just 1 month after that devastating disaster, on August 18, 1924, the Freiwillige Feuerwehr, the FFW, the Volunteer Fire Department, was officially founded.
So they went from Pflicht, from obligation, to Freiwillig, to voluntary.
Exactly. And that transition from mandatory apathy to voluntary commitment was a deliberate, powerful act of civic maturity. The message was clear. If they wanted protection, they had to organize it, train for it, and commit their own time and their own resources to it.
And they established a structure right away, didn't they? They realized that passion requires discipline. Who were the men who brought this new, necessary order to Pontaricum?
The foundational leaders were men who understood that organization was absolutely paramount. A man named Alois Dahm stepped up as Brandmeister, the firemaster. So he was the key administrative and planning guy.
Okay.
And then Johann Wirtz took the operational command as Oberbrandmeister, the chief firemaster. These two men, they instilled the strict discipline and organization that the compulsory corps utterly lacked. They transformed mere duty into a point of profound civic honor.
We also hear about specialists. Paul Schneiders, he took on a specific leadership role heading up the Steigerabteilung. For listeners who aren't familiar with early 20th century firefighting, what exactly was the function of the Steigerabteilung?
The Steigerabteilung was the ladder or climbing unit. You can think of them as the highly specialized technical corps.
The elite squad.
The elite squad, exactly. In a densely packed village like Pontaricum, with all these multi-story timber-framed homes built right up against each other, the fire rarely stays on the ground floor. It goes up.
Right into the roofs.
Into the roofs. So they needed men skilled in rapidly scaling walls and roofs, breaking them open to vent the fire, or rescuing people trapped on upper floors. All before the fire could spread from rooftop to rooftop. They were the shock troops of the FFW.
And that required extreme courage and skill, especially without modern equipment.
Oh, absolutely. They lacked modern aerial apparatus, turntable ladders. Schneider's was putting his life and the lives of his team on the line for the community.
That just shifts the whole psychology, doesn't it? They weren't just reacting to a crisis anymore. They were actively building a resilient, technically organized local institution, completely independent of the bankrupt state. But let's go back to a critical point you raised earlier, the economic situation. They're carrying laundry baskets full of worthless marks. So how did this new FFW even get the necessary equipment?
That's a vital question.
Did they just use the old stuff from the Flickfeuerwehr, or did this new cohesion somehow lead to them pooling resources?
Well, in the immediate aftermath of the hyperinflation peak, purchasing new, substantial equipment was nearly impossible for the town coffers. So they had to rely heavily on what they inherited. Simple hand pumps, buckets, and, crucially, the rigorous organization of their existing, if rudimentary, apparatus.
So their strength was human capital, not material wealth.
Precisely. It's likely that specialized items like leather buckets and ropes were financed through community collections, or through what the Germans call Verzicht, the self-sacrifice of the members themselves, who pooled their own funds to upgrade the simple necessities. Their focus had to be on training and efficiency, making the most of very, very little.
And of course, any organization built on pride and training has to eventually prove its worth under real pressure.
Yes, the true moment of validation for this young FFW arrived 4 years later in the summer of 1928.
On August 10th, 1928, they faced their ultimate proof of concept. Another major fire, testing whether this new system could actually handle the intense demands of a spreading fire in their own tight quarters.
And this is a far more serious threat than the disaster of 1924, because it happened after they had staked their entire communal pride on this new force.
The pressure must have been immense.
It was. A large fire erupted, and it rapidly threatened 4 interconnected houses, those belonging to the Boos, Holton, and Mergler families. The fire chronology sources confirm how severe it was. This event partially or totally destroyed 3 of those homes.
So this was a massive, immediate challenge for a force that was still relying on simple equipment and just newly acquired discipline.
So you have to picture the scene, right? 4 years of training, 4 years of sacrifice, all hanging on this one night. They're facing the same material circumstances as the helpless Corps of 1924, but with a profoundly different mentality.
And what was the outcome?
The difference was night and day. Despite the intense pressure and the simple tools, we are talking about human chains, manual pumps, and the ladders of the Steigerabteilung, the young FFW succeeded. They combated and contained the fire before it could consume the entire block.
So they managed the spread.
They managed the spread, and most importantly, they limited the loss of life and property far more effectively than the old system ever could have.
This success didn't just save buildings, did it? It saved the credibility of the community's entire project of self-reliance.
Absolutely. The success justified its creation. It significantly solidified the community's sense of cohesion and pride. They realized that organized voluntary effort was the only reliable institution they had left. And this victory, it provided an invaluable psychological pillar during the ongoing, unreliable Weimar years. The central government might be printing worthless notes in Berlin, but locally, they were building real, tangible value in human capital, in organization, and in their capacity for collective defense.
So we've established these struggles, the fight against economic collapse and the struggle against literal fire. But there was also this constant daily struggle against despair and anxiety.
The quiet fight.
The quiet fight. And this brings us back to the cultural heart of the Mosul region, where wine served as more than just a commodity for barter. It was the fuel for the necessary human spirit.
That's such essential context. Amidst all this intense seriousness, the French occupation, the economic instability, the new, almost militarized discipline of the FFW humor and Geselligkeit, or sociability, function as a vital pressure release valve.
A way to blow off steam.
Exactly. Yeah. And the sources highlight the tough economic reality. Most tradesmen, the Stellmacher, the cartwrights, the Schreiner, the carpenters, they relied heavily on side income from their own little vineyards. Their primary trade alone could not possibly support their families during the crisis.
So wine was everything.
It was simultaneously a necessary trade good, a commercial hedge against inflation, and the primary vehicle for psychological release.
So this Geselligkeit, this sociability, it wasn't frivolous. It was a socio-economic necessity. It distributed risk, maintained morale, and allowed these struggling tradesmen to conduct business informally.
Precisely. And this is where we meet some legendary local characters, the family Scher, who really represented what's called the unverwüstlichen Mosellanischen humor, unbreakable Mosel humor, which is a concrete manifestation of that trust mentality we talked about earlier.
Tell us about the brothers.
We're focusing on two brothers, Heinrich and Jakob Scher, from the Römerstraße. They were Stellmacher and Kistenschreiner cartwrights and boxmakers.
So trade's absolutely essential for the vineyard economy.
Essential, yet trades that struggled immensely when people had no cash. And they were famous throughout the village for their immense love of socializing and, well, let's just say, for enjoying the fruits of their secondary labor.
Okay. And the sources provide one of those memorable laugh-out-loud local sayings, a perfect piece of regional wit that just immortalized them. What was the famous line?
The saying went that the Schaut brothers were often so blau as the enamel house number signs they mounted.
So blau, which means blue, but also means...
drunk. As drunk as the blue enamel house number signs they installed. Now, the sources do provide a small historical caveat here. The enamel signs were actually mounted a bit later, in the 1940s.
Okay.
But the fact that this specific visual association became their defining legacy confirms that their character, their reputation for being delightfully, cheerfully intoxicated, or blue, was absolutely established and notorious in this turbulent Weimar era.
It's a wonderful piece of visual humor, and it's rooted in their very profession. They were known for putting up signs, and they became symbols themselves. But how does this kind of humor connect back to the desperate situation of inflation and fire?
It provides the essential human counterpoint. That Trotston mentality means you acknowledge the severity of the crisis, the hyperinflation, the occupation, the threat of fire, but you refuse to let it extinguish your spirit.
You laugh in its face.
You laugh in its face. The Scher brothers embodied this resilience through their humor and their persistent Geselligkeit. Even when the mark was completely worthless, the local spirit and the sheer abundance of wine, the community's real liquid wealth persisted.
So we have this perfect contrast, the hyper-seriousness, the discipline, the organized sobriety of the new FFW leaders, Dom and Wirtz, who were dedicated to order,
Right.
set against the easygoing, defiant resilience represented by the Scher brothers. One group saved the homes from fire. The other, you could say, saved the community's soul from despair.
That's a great way to put it. This Geselligkeit also functioned almost as a political safety valve. By focusing so much energy on local clubs, on sociability, and yes, a bit of lighthearted excess, the community channeled its energy away from the potentially destructive national politics that were tearing Germany apart in Berlin.
They invested it locally instead.
They invested in local cohesion. They prioritized human connection over political factionalism.
Now, as we transition into the final years of this epoch, we hit the beginning of the Weltwirtschaftskrise, the Great Depression.
Right, and financial difficulties, which had eased slightly with the introduction of the Rentenmark in 1923, they returned with immense force leading into 1932. Economic hardship was, once again, immense.
This is what's so counterintuitive to me. Despite the renewed economic misery and the tightening belts of the global depression, cultural and club life for Einsleben, it didn't collapse. It actually seems to have flourished.
It's a recurring theme in history, isn't it? When external systems fail and global markets contract, internal local networks become exponentially more important. People just double down on local identity, local support, and local institutions as a hedge against global chaos.
What specific examples do the sources give us of this vibrant local life thriving in the face of all this poverty?
We see two distinct pillars of cultural activity. First, the Junggesellenverein, which is the bachelor's club. They maintain this vigorous tradition of performing theatrical plays.
So local live entertainment.
Highly involved local entertainment. Writing, rehearsing, performing. It's a massive distraction from the daily worries.
And crucially, where were these performances held? The venue often tells you a lot about the culture.
They held these performances in the Saalbau, the community hall, which was owned by the Schneiders family. The sources specifically mention Heinrich Josef Schneiders as the proprietor and innkeeper who provided this crucial cultural infrastructure.
The same family as Paul Schneider's from the fire department's ladder unit.
It seems very likely they were related. And this same family was also noted in the sources for their heavy involvement in the wine trade during this era. So you see this deep integration. The local commercial backbone, the innkeeper and wine merchant, is also underwriting the cultural life of the village by providing the space.
So the Schneider's family wasn't just facilitating commerce, they were actively subsidizing and safeguarding the community's emotional infrastructure. What was the second pillar?
The second pillar was the Männergesangverein, the men's choir, which was called Borussia 1863.
So an old institution.
A very old and serious institution, dedicated to maintaining the area's heritage and song. And we know the depth of their roots because the records show this choir had hosted a massive regional festival way back in 1873. They had 14 other choirs and a local orchestra, the Simonische Kapelle, attend.
And maintaining that level of organizational quality and commitment to tradition during economic devastation of the early 1930s, that was a profound, silent act of cultural defiance, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. These clubs, the choir, the theater group, they were the ultimate antidepressant. They provided connection, purpose, and reliable entertainment when money couldn't buy any of those things. The community was investing its time and energy into relationships rather than currency.
As the world headed toward the darkest economic depths in the early 1930s, Pundrik performed one final, large-scale community act that really symbolized the strength and cohesion they had forged since the collapse of 19, and that was the War Memorial, built in 1932.
The decision to build a memorial in 1932, right at the peak of the Great Depression, is stunning. Despite the truly great poverty, the citizens of Pontaricum voluntarily donated funds for a Kriegererinnermal, a war memorial.
This requires a moment of focus, because building a monument during a severe depression seems completely counterintuitive. Most communities would be prioritizing, I don't know, soup kitchens. What was the significance of this act of doing without?
It speaks volumes about their values. The memorial was not built with outside subsidies or state financing or borrowed money. It was constructed entirely from local stone and financed through the personal sacrifice and Versicht of the citizens themselves.
So what does Versicht really mean in this context?
Well, for a tradesman or a small vineyard owner who was already struggling to feed, say, 8 children, Versicht meant trading a few marks that could have bought necessities, a new pair of shoes or an extra sack of flour, for a symbolic structure.
They were prioritizing collective memory, dignity, and civic pride over immediate physical comfort.
That's it exactly.
How was the local stone acquired and the labor organized? Was this also voluntary labor?
While the sources focus more on the financial Versicht, the use of local stone strongly suggests a parallel mobilization of local labor and resources. It was likely undertaken by craftsmen and builders who donated their time or were compensated minimally, maybe through barter, as part of the overall community effort.
So the monument itself was an active expression of community cohesion, not just a passive object.
Yes, it was a physical manifestation of their ability to rally resources and undertake a major project entirely independently of those failed central state structures.
So its inauguration in 1932, it wasn't just about honoring the dead of World War I. It served as this massive, tangible conclusion to this difficult epoch, symbolizing the community's own survival and self-sufficiency.
It was a declaration.
We stand on our own ground, paid for by our own sacrifice.
It was a collective psychological victory over the economic forces that were trying to disintegrate them.
So let's try and summarize the key takeaways for you from Puntaric's masterclass in local resilience during the Weimar Republic. This era was really characterized by 3 crucial interconnected themes.
The first, as we saw, was economic self-reliance. That absolute necessity of returning to barter and local resource exchange, wine for nails, bacon for shoes, in the face of hyperinflation.
Proving that true wealth resided in tangible, local goods, not national paper currency.
Right. And second, civic responsibility and institutional innovation. The spontaneous, rapid formation of the Freiwillig Feuerwehr after the 1924 fire. That transitioned the town from an outdated compulsory system to a modern model of proactive, organized local governance that was powered by pride.
And third, what you called cultural fortitude, the way that long-standing tradition, vibrant club life, the Vereinsleben, and that essential necessary humor, like the kind demonstrated by the delightfully Blauscher brothers, provided the necessary emotional infrastructure. It allowed the community to withstand chronic financial stress and profound despair. That cultural investment was survival.
The ultimate lesson here is pretty clear, I think. The community's true wealth, during a time when their vineyards were often yielding poorly, due to both economic and weather challenges wasn't the quality of the vintage, but its cohesion.
And this cohesion was exemplified both by figures like Alois Dom organizing a disciplined defense force and by the average townspeople funding a solemn monument through painful personal sacrifice.
At the end of the day, when national structures fail, voluntary local organization and commitment, the ability to look inward and rely on your neighbor, become the most critical ingredient for maintaining survival and dignity.
We saw earlier how the inflation and poverty of this time drove people like the carpenter Schreiner Klein to consider the drastic measure of emigration, seeking a better future in Brazil or America.
That pull was incredibly strong.
That promise of foreign wealth was a powerful, almost irresistible pull away from the Moselle. But the source material also reveals that the deep roots, the communal commitments, and the local pride were often stronger forces. They kept people rooted or even brought some immigrants back.
And that tension raises the final provocative thought for you to mull over as you finish this deep dive. The severe economic conditions drove citizens to desperately seek new lives abroad, abandoning their historical ground. Yet these deep roots and the weight of community kept others anchored, or even eventually brought some returnees, like Caspar Race and others, back to Pontaricum, despite the known hardship. So which force, the siren song of foreign wealth and freedom, or the binding weight of local community, of shared sacrifice and deep familial roots, do you believe ultimately defines the long-term history and character of a place like Pontaricum? Is it hope for the future, or is it loyalty to the past?
Food for thought. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.